San Marino, a beautiful micronation of 33,000 people, entirely enclaved within Italy and perched atop the Monte Titano. A nation founded in 301 AD, which may by some definitions make it the oldest nation in the world, certainly has the world's oldest constitution, ratified as it was in 1600. San Marino rose to international fame in 2021 when Flo Rida randomly appeared on stage for the nation during the Eurovision Song Contest, despite Flo Rida not being from San Marino. A nation with the same population as Motherwell, San Marino is perhaps best known for not being home to Flo Rida, but also being home to the world's worst football team. And no, I do not mean Motherwell FC. But is San Marino really the worst football team in the world? Well, according to the FIFA World Rankings, they are. And let's be honest, opportunistic YouTubers have not been slow in pursuing the meme. But the problem is FIFA is wrong, and so is every opportunistic content creator using the term world's worst. When I was but a lad, and I have to admit that was a very long time ago, there was a prevailing belief that San Marino were the very worst football team in the world. Many of my friends loudly exclaimed that they could play for La Serenissima, and largely this bravado was perpetuated by the organisation of UEFA in the late 90s, where the only competitive games the Minnows of European football got was against much larger nations, and you would routinely see the likes of San Marino and Andorra getting shoo-ins from Germany and France. The disparity was wild, and those types of games did little to actually help small nations develop. It also tended to skew the opinion of European football fans who, due to limited coverage of world football, had little knowledge of the sport beyond the boundaries of UEFA, save for when the World Cups came around, and then other teams much stronger than San Marino still managed to get shoo-ins against the monoliths of Europe and South America. The opinion on how wretched San Marino was tempered in April 2001 when American Samoa lost 31-0 to Australia, a scoreline which made world news. This had come 4 years after the Maldives were defeated 17-0 by Iran in a World Cup qualifier that garnered far less international attention. I at this time was already a connoisseur of obscure football. As a young teen, I'd become fascinated in the lower echelons of European and English football and would collect the Rothmans football yearbooks that would detail global leagues in detail. I would write to secretaries I'd find in the non-league football directory that existed at the time requesting matchday programs. I was very much a football nerd, and for a long time before it became fashionable, I was very much of the opinion that San Marino were far from being the worst football team in the world. The worst team in Europe? Yes, by a significant margin, but Europe isn't the only place football exists, and that's a very good thing. Nobody thinks Venezuela is the next worst football team in the world. Inter's Josef Martinez and former West Brom star Salomon Rondon are both products of Venezuela. Yet Venezuela is the only South American nation to never qualify for a World Cup, and one of only 2 South American nations to never win the Copa America. But using Venezuela is kind of facetious. Anyone who knows anything about world football knows that the CONMEBOL Confederation is arguably the hardest confederation in world football in terms of being small, but densely packed with some of the world's best nations, and ably supported by some very competitive World Cup regulars such as Peru, Chile, Ecuador and Colombia, and fading giants such as Uruguay and, right now, Brazil.
No, God! No, God, please, no!
When your weak opponents are Bolivia and Paraguay, both former World Cup attendees, Venezuela's all-time competitive record of played 498, won 133, drawn 112, and lost 253 is not bad. By contrast, San Marino's record stands at played 203, won 1, drawn 9, lost 193. That's one win all time, coming against Liechtenstein in 2004 in a friendly. It was a 1-0 win. They have also gone on to draw twice with Liechtenstein, meaning that 30% of their best results have come against another fellow UEFA minnow. Perhaps their most eyebrow-raising result came during the 1994 World Cup qualifying campaign, when they managed to draw to a Turkey side that included the likes of Tugay Kerimoglu and Bülent Korkmaz. Of course, that's not the result most England fans remember. Turkey had a mare in what was a frankly nightmarish group that, aside from our San Marino heroes, also contained England, Netherlands, Poland, and Norway. Netherlands and England were heavily favoured to qualify, and despite a good start, Turkey fell away badly. What nobody had anticipated was a Norwegian side that hadn't qualified for a major tournament since 1938 to win the group, leaving Poland, England, and Netherlands all vying for the final qualification space, with San Marino the whipping boys at the bottom. Now, what people tend to forget is how important a role the whipping boys play in qualification. There's a reason teams hate drawing the Faroe Islands from the bottom pot, because they're the most bankable minnow in terms of pulling off surprise results and grounding even the best teams with draws. San Marino have never played spoiler in that way, but they have become the goal difference factor. I say have because 1994 was only their second World Cup qualifying campaign. Indeed, the group qualifiers kicked off with Norway destroying San Marino 10-0 in Oslo. San Marino would also go on to lose 6-0 in London, 6-0 in Utrecht, and 7-0 in the returning fixture played in Bologna, Italy. Headed into the final game of the qualifiers, England, who'd made the semi-finals in Italia 90, needed to win by 7 clear goals and hoped Poland defeated Netherlands. And much as the English media tend to do, they buoyed up the fact that San Marino was a team made up of useless waiters, and the only uncertainty would be if an already eliminated Poland could defeat the Dutch in Poland. This seemed to forget that England had only managed to put 6 past the waiters at Wembley, but much of the hyperbole was because the British media were building a pedestal from which to topple Graham Taylor, who by now had worn out his welcome in the media and fans after a disappointing qualification campaign. But then the unthinkable happened.
San Marino in blue, England needing to win by a 7-goal margin and hope that Poland can do them a favour in Poznan against Holland. I'm sure you're aware now of what's at stake. And Bachoki, number 9, picks the ball up straight away, and San Marino launched the first attack. Oh, and a mistake by Stuart Pearce, and San Marino had scored. I don't believe this. Stuart Pearce tried to pass the ball back to David Seaman. Galtieri. Extraordinary.
Striker David Galtieri stole in to score after 8.3 seconds. At the time, this was the fastest goal in World Cup qualifying history. To add to the humiliation, the waiters, Galtieri actually worked in an electronics shop and most of the team weren't in fact waiters, would hold on manfully for the next 21 minutes before England would equalise. England would go on to win 7-1, not enough even if Poland had won, which they didn't. It was all moot, but for the longest time it would be the defining moment for San Marino football. To this day, Galtieri is still celebrated in the micronation of 30,000. The goal was only the third San Marino had scored in competitive matches, and it was a meaningful tally. But this little trip down memory lane ignores some pretty eye-watering numbers. 1 win and 9 draws in 203 competitive matches. How can San Marino not be the worst team in the world? I mean, after all, there's no shortage of content creators baying at the doors of FIFA's basement team. Now, full disclosure, for my British viewers, I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, but in the last edition of the UEFA Nations League, Sky Sports offered coverage of all the Nations League games through their digital services. And for legal purposes, I hasten to add, this is not a plug. While 99.9% of my British compatriots were watching England, Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, and the other 0.1 were watching the nations of their birth or heritage, I was the 0.01% utilising the opportunity to watch the greats of San Marino and Liechtenstein lock horns again. And well, the truth is, San Marino are in their longest drought of meaningful results in their history. The win against Liechtenstein in 2004 was the last noteworthy result, and after 19 years, half of my life, things look bleak. But the UEFA Nations League has given San Marino hope. Regular competitive football against similarly sized UEFA minnows such as Liechtenstein and Gibraltar has allowed football to develop without the fear of being constantly shelled and allowed the team to play a more open style of football at home. The results have seen a marked improvement, evidenced with their recent games against Denmark and Finland, and in the last year San Marino also played a friendly against St. Lucia. Now, St. Lucia is managed by Stern John, a name people of my age should be familiar with. St. Lucia play in the CONCACAF Confederation, and San Marino earned a 1-1 draw. They would also draw 0-0 with the Seychelles, who play in the African CAF in a friendly. Now, we're going to go into some unfamiliar confederations right now. While the result against Seychelles was no great shakes, Seychelles are ranked 196th in the world and routinely get papped out of qualifying competitions in Africa at fairly early stages. The results against St. Lucia showed a marked improvement. St. Lucia currently lie 171st in the world and recently went unbeaten in their CONCACAF Nations League. The CONCACAF Nations League was inaugurated in 2019-20 after a qualifying tournament was held. St. Lucia weren't even in the bottom pot in the seeded qualification event and went on to only lose to Haiti. The 34 members of CONCACAF were ranked from 1 to 34 to decide on division, and St. Lucia finished 13th of 34. Now, it's worth mentioning the USA, Mexico, Honduras, Panama, Guatemala and Costa Rica didn't enter the qualification competition as they were all in the final stages of CONCACAF World Cup qualifying. And truth be told, after a stellar pre-qualification, St. Lucia bombed. They were relegated in a group that contained El Salvador and the Dominican Republic and Montserrat, and keep that final name in mind. However, that placed them in the weaker League C in 2022-23, and in a group that contained Anguilla and Dominica, St. Lucia ran away winning all 4 games. Now, you may ask, why are we talking about St. Lucia? Well, this is a team San Marino played the equal of in their 2-game friendlies, both played in St. Lucia, although it is worth noting that it did take San Marino until the 94th minute to equalise in the first game, before losing the second game 3 days later. But more importantly, St. Lucia are far from the worst team in the CONCACAF, let alone the world. Now, I work in the Caribbean, and so I caught quite a bit of the 2022-23 edition of the CONCACAF Nations Cup, as the CONCACAF channel were pretty brilliant in providing footage and commentary for every game. And it's clear that some of the nations in the Caribbean are tiny, lack the numbers or the infrastructure in a way that would be comfortably outcompeted by San Marino. A few in particular that I have visited in my career would be Anguilla, the British Virgin Islands and the United States Virgin Islands, as well as one nation I have never visited, the Turks and Caicos Islands. Now, Anguilla has a population half of San Marino and lies like a peculiar sandbar at odds to the islands all around it. Despite its tiny size at 16 miles long by 3 miles wide and its small population, it does manage to field a remarkably full 11-team league with a second tier below. Even cooler, the channel AI Live, an Anguilla news and sports channel, live streams many of the league games as well as the national team, and as a connoisseur of obscure sports, I will admit I've watched a few Anguilla league games. The pitch is bad, as I believe almost all the games are played on the same pitch, which is a mix of sand and grass, and skill levels are low. But I love that they can field 11 teams in a nation of 15,000, and there is an enormous passion for the game. And what's even more remarkable is Anguilla didn't finish bottom of their group, despite being second bottom to San Marino in the World Rankings. It's a shame we can't rerun the other final again. Now, you may be asking, what is the other final? Well, let me recount one of my favourite international football stories. And remember I told you to recall Montserrat? Well, this is the reason. In 2002, the Dutch advertising agency Kessels Kramer arranged and paid for the 2 lowest ranked teams in the FIFA World Rankings to compete in an alternative final on the same day as the 2002 World Cup final. It was a brilliant idea with an amazing backstory. At the time, the 2 lowest ranked teams in the world were Montserrat and Bhutan. Bhutan was something of an anomaly and remain a bit of an anomaly as a tourist destination to this day. The tiny landlocked Himalayan nation is one of the world's most beautiful nations and stalwartly protects this by levying a charge of $200 a day for any foreign visitor other than Indian nationals. And much as the nation is a mystery, the origins of their national team remains one to this day. They either played their first international match in 1982 or possibly 8 years earlier in a tournament in Nepal. The 80s and 90s were something of the dog days for football in small nations. A problem San Marino never suffered as UEFA members was huge absences of fixtures caused by the qualifying processes and the lack of meaningful friendlies, which often left teams like Bhutan in the AFC, Montserrat in the CONCACAF, and the Seychelles in the CAF without fixtures for years at a time. Bhutan went over a decade without a competitive fixture due to a lack of finance and infrastructure, despite being admitted as a member of the AFC in 1994. And it was clear on their return to the international scene in 1999 that their absence had weakened the side against those playing regularly. They lost 7-0 to Nepal, who were ranked in the 160s at the time themselves. Matters only worsened when they faced Kuwait in 2000 in the qualification rounds of the AFC Asian Cup, where a hastily assembled Bhutan side lost 20-0. This was the 7th worst result in international football history. It was small wonder Bhutan found themselves at the foot of the world rankings, but their travails were nothing compared to those of Montserrat. Most people my age will remember the eruption of Soufriere Hills volcano in 1995 that wiped the Montserrat capital Plymouth from the face of the earth. The pyroclastic flow killed 19 and led to 7,000 people, 2/3 of the island's population, being evacuated. 3,000 ended up remaining in the Caribbean on islands like Antigua and Barbuda, while 3,000 ended up in the UK as the islands were a British protectorate, and the HMS Liverpool was instrumental in the evacuation of the island. More than half the island became an exclusion zone, and to this day it's an eerie place to sail past. This had a devastating effect on football. For 4 years, Montserrat did not compete at all, and the disaster caused the total cessation of all sports activity on the islands, including the Football League, which had only been run sporadically before the eruption. The only international standard football pitch was destroyed in the eruption, and as such, the Montserratian national team could never play at home. This was why Kessel's Kramer paid for the entire national team of Montserrat and its staff, as well as the $200 a day surcharge for every member of the Montserrat delegation, to pitch up in Thimphu, Bhutan, at the Changla Stadium, in what is honestly one of the most amazing looking football stadiums in the world. They were there to play the alternative World Cup final. Over 15,000 Bhutanese attended, and the game was met with great anticipation. For me, someone who is pretty turned off by the money at the top end of the sport, I find this amazing. But obviously this isn't going to be every Premier League or Bundesliga's fan cup of tea. Now, I heartily suggest you go seek out the documentary that was made about the game. It's been uploaded on YouTube and I'll link it down below. This was filmed in 2003 and it looks like it's been ripped from a VHS and played through a PS1, but just deal with it. It kind of gives it that sort of veneer of footage of the first Technicolor World Cups in the 1970s. As such, I'm not going to give away the score. It's widely available to look up, and I'll post a link to the Wikipedia article down below as well. But even if you do look up the score, seriously watch the documentary. It's really neat and demonstrates the passions guys representing these Minnows feel, and for context, the match footage only starts around 59 minutes into the documentary. But I've gone on a wild tangent. The remarkable element for me when I first heard about the other final that was pitched in January 2002 was not that San Marino weren't going to feature, because back in the early 2000s, the FIFA rankings did tend to at least make some sense, and I knew San Marino were not one of the worst teams in the world. No, what was truly remarkable was the absence of an OFC member, particularly American Samoa, who just months before had lost 31-0 to Australia. Now, if you weren't strapped in before, strap in now, because we're really heading into the reeds of world football. We're heading to the only confederation that doesn't have a guaranteed berth at World Cups, despite its members covering almost the entire Pacific Ocean. We're heading to the members of the Oceania Football Confederation. Now, I opened this all up by saying that many European football fans were ignorant of football outside the realm of UEFA and maybe the Common Bowl back in the late 90s. But today, the proliferation of Asian footballers that first started making the trek after the likes of Hidetoshi Nakata and Ali Daei, and forgotten trailblazer Charbon Kun, who played for Eintracht Frankfurt and Bayern Leverkusen in the 80s, coupled with the likes of Gary Lineker playing in Japan, has broadened European knowledge of the AFC. Meanwhile, African players have been a regular sight in Europe since the late 70s and early 80s, and the wide-scale broadcasting of the African Cup of Nations, a tournament I used to watch with my dad, has made the CAF's premium tournament a more household name in recent times. But to this day, the OFC remains an obscure enigma in world football, and has probably gone backwards since Australia decamped in 2006, seeking automatic World Cup qualification in the AFC. Couple this with the risible coverage offered by the OFC on its YouTube page, hampered by the logistical geographical nightmare that is the scattergun of barely populated atoll islands that have spread like buckshot across the Pacific Ocean. And the OFC and the quality of its teams remains largely unknown, save for the New Zealand national team that offer the only notable side in world competition. And even then, much as is a common thread through the minuscule 10 other members of the OFC, football isn't really New Zealand's first sport, or even its second or third. With populations spread across multiple islands, the other members, save for Fiji, Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, face incredible logistical challenges to make football viable, and getting internationally sanctioned pitches to work on Coral Atoll Islands is no mean feat either. So to make a bold prediction, if the OFC operated its qualifying tournament like, say, the Copa America and was allowed to invite guests, I think San Marino would finish middle, maybe top half. Right now, the OFC, more than any other confederation, benefits from the way the FIFA World Rankings work, because unlike UEFA or the CONCACAF or even the CAF or AFC, the weakest teams in the OFC, which are very weak, regularly play against teams that are pretty much of a muchness when it comes to quality, which is why the FIFA World Rankings really need to start putting a greater emphasis on the quality of opposition, much in the same way the NCAA does with college football. Now, please don't see this as me dunking on OFC teams. The reason this is such an exhaustive video is I have a real passion for this level of sport, and teams in the OFC have to endure more travel than most just to play in their qualifiers, and no confederation was as disrupted by the global pandemic than the OFC. Those that keep football alive in the atolls do so with a real love and passion for the game. The extent of the impact of the pandemic culminated in the OFC being unable to host its World Cup qualifiers in their native region due to the distances and travel involved. As such, the OFC, after FIFA approval, flew those associations willing to Qatar as a closed-doors test tournament for the stadia. Ultimately, only 8 of the 11 full FIFA members made it to Doha, and both Vanuatu and the Cook Islands succumbed to outbreaks in their squad before they could finish the tournament. The final saw the region's one standout nation, New Zealand, ease past arguably the next best team in the region, the Solomon Islands, by 5-0. Ultimately, it would all be moot, as New Zealand would lose to Costa Rica in the final playoff. Since the departure of Australia, OFC finals have largely been contested by New Zealand and the Solomons, with New Caledonia and Papua New Guinea providing occasional, if distant, competition. Tahiti is the only team to win a major tournament that New Zealand have taken part in, winning the 2012 OFC Nations Cup. Discounting Vanuatu and Fiji, who tend to be competitive, the remaining members tend to squabble amongst themselves to avoid being the worst. I think it's fair to assume San Marino could easily give Vanuatu ranked 165th and Fiji ranked 170th a pretty decent game. Now, despite their onerous loss to Australia in 2001, American Samoan football has shown shoots of recovery. Despite still languishing 186th in the world, they have recently beaten Tonga twice, who have become the whipping boys of the OFC. Sort of. And to be fair, Tonga is best known as a rugby union nation. In 2014, a British documentary crew followed the American Samoan team in their efforts to qualify for the 2014 World Cup. The resulting documentary was called Next Goal Wins, and it's another great documentary covering a rather overlooked corner of world football, and is available to stream through YouTube Movies and TV for anybody who's interested in seeing coverage of the Pacific game. Now, let's get one thing clear. Tonga are bad. And if I was to replay the other final between 2 current FIFA members, I would probably pick Tonga versus Anguilla or the Turks and Caicos, because I think San Marino could comfortably beat either team. With that said, Tonga are far from the worst team in the OFC. The OFC is peculiar due to its sheer number of associate members, satellite members, and possible future members. Now, I'm not going to go into each and every one. Some of these are tiny micronations like Nauru with a population of 10,000, no league, and Aussie rules as the island's favourite sport. You also have Bougainville, which is due to gain full independence from Papua New Guinea in 2027. But the eye-catching nation is the Federated States of Micronesia. Now, the none of you still left watching this are probably asking, how did we get from San Marino to the Federated States of Micronesia? Well, the reason I want to highlight the FSM is they gained a fair bit of notoriety in 2015 when their under-23 team pitched up to the 2015 edition of the Pacific Games, which was also being used as an Olympic football qualifying event. The tournament started a little wobbly for the Micronesians when they dropped a close 30-0 loss to Tahiti, although to be fair the Cook Islands also succumbed to the same scoreline against Tahiti in the 1971 edition, and the Cook Islands are now ranked 189th in the world, which isn't great, but it's certainly better than a 30-0 loss to Tahiti. Matters didn't improve in the next game, as after conceding 21 goals in the first half to Fiji, Micronesia subbed their poor goalkeeper Walter Pettigrew and replaced him with midfield Dominic Goddard. Goddard fared a little better in the sticks, conceding just 17, but that might just have been Fiji taking their foot off the pedal. The Micronesian manager Stan Foster later admitted that his small squad of only 18 had largely only started playing in the 18 months prior, and many of his players came from villages where football wasn't played at all. For his part, the Fijian manager Juan Carlos Bazzetti apologised, saying that they had to run up the score because Tahiti had. And this didn't augur well headed into match 3. Vanuatu, whose senior team was ranked 200th in the world at the time, had to score a minimum of 30 goals to qualify for the next round. Thoroughly demoralised by this point, Micronesia would eventually cough up 46 goals, which, to be honest, was excessive. Micronesia would finish with a record of 3 played, no wins, no draws, 3 losses, no goals scored, and 114 conceded, meaning within a matter of days, Micronesia owned 3 of the 4 worst scores in international football since 1997. It's worth noting that in that time, San Marino have never conceded more than 13, and that was against Germany in 2006, not 200th ranked Vanuatu. Now, in fairness, the Micronesian team was much younger than its competitors. Many of their players had never played on a full-size pitch owing to the limited infrastructure in Micronesia. Many had never even left their own villages, let alone flown across the Pacific. Despite the somewhat tone-deaf international media coverage, the Micronesians were well regarded by their opponents for never giving up. But sadly, despite being invited to compete again in 2019, their failure to secure FIFA affiliation meant the national soccer program collapsed. And that's a shame. For every dickhead who thinks it's a sick burn to point out how much better their pub team is to teams like the Micronesian under-23 team, they have very little perspective about finding a passion for a sport that has absolutely no infrastructure or heritage in their nation. These kids, like the guys who line up against insurmountable odds for San Marino, do so because of a passion and a love for the sport, and they're building the traditions and the heritage that normal people like you or I lining up for our pub team could only dream of doing. David Galtieri is a legend in San Marino. Nicky Salapu, the most capped player for American Samoa, became the poster boy for next goal wins and kept goal in American Samoa's first ever World Cup qualifier. These are things you will never achieve playing the 12th tier of English football unless you're of American Samoan heritage. One thing that never fails to disappoint me as a sports fan is how fans from bigger nations love to shit on teams that are of zero threat to them, that exist in an entirely different ecosphere of the sport. The guys who represent San Marino or American Samoa football or, Indonesia ice hockey do so with enormous passion, do so whilst juggling day-to-day jobs, and do so without the benefit of the infrastructure we grew up with. Honestly, if I see another fan in the comments section of an OFC game or a San Marino highlights package saying how shit the teams are, I might scream, because the real irony is you are not good enough to represent San Marino. You're only good enough to represent San Marino if you play around the 7th tier in England. And the chances are you don't. And let's be honest, if you were good enough and you could represent those nations at an international level, are you telling me you wouldn't? If I found out I had American Samoan ancestry, I would be making myself known to their FA while I was still at a decent level, as anyone there on mine surely would do. But the bottom line, the answer to the question posed at the start, is no. San Marino are not the worst team in the world. Far from it. San Marino posed the real issue with the weighting of the FIFA World Rankings, and to a lesser extent so does Sri Lanka when they can be ranked beneath Guam, another team that could arguably be described as the worst national team in the world. You may have noticed in the graphic I showed earlier, but Guam owned 4 of the 16 worst results in international football since 1997. In 2000 they lost to Tajikistan 16-0. This was 2 days after losing 19-0 to Iran, having earlier in the year lost to China by the same margin, and in 2005 they lost to North Korea 21-0. Now, things have improved marginally for Guam. Much like American Samoa, they've started scouting the US for players with Guamanian heritage in the last decade. And a bit like Equatorial Guinea, who did the same in Portugal prior to hosting the 2012 African Cup of Nations, it has seen the team enjoy improved results. But unlike Equatorial Guinea, Guam are a long way from qualifying for an international tournament. They did, however, manage to make the group stages of the AFC World Cup qualifiers, having disposed of our old friends Bhutan in the pre-qualifier, quite comfortably. However, 8 losses in 8 games saw Guam finish 7 points behind the next weakest team in their group, which was the Maldives. And remember when I mentioned them getting shelled 17-0 by Iran earlier. And speaking of improvement, it's great to see Montserratian football on the up. While their native football league still struggles to gain traction, it's amazing to see a team effectively born from diaspora come on in such leaps and bounds, and just shows that even a tiny population of 3,000 and their children, when brought up in a nation where football has such an established infrastructure, can go on to do amazing things. The latest Montserrat squad is made up entirely of players born in England or Europe and plying their trade in the English lower leagues, and however you feel about that, Montserrat has little choice. With the OFC talking about inaugurating their own version of a Nations League tournament, I feel like we will soon see a far more competitive group of Minnows. These teams are never going to be able to go toe-to-toe with the best teams in the world, and it's just luck of the draw that we get to be born in a massive nation with such a strong infrastructure in place to develop sport. But as much as some fans loathe the Nations League, and I sort of question the value of them for bigger nations, Nations Leagues such as the one UEFA and CONCACAF have created really help give small teams a chance to compete and develop their game in an ecosystem that isn't geared against them. It seems a great pity to me that just as the Minnows of Europe start to improve, there are increasing calls for their automatic participation in qualification campaigns to be denied. And these small nations are improving. There are those that will point to the results of Gibraltar and San Marino and say that there should be a pre-qualification tournament, that these teams will never qualify, and of course, they won't. But it's not just the San Marinos of the world improving. Standards are, minus a few exceptions such as Cyprus and Latvia, improving across the board. Even traditionally mediocre sides in Europe are in a state of improvement, like North Macedonia and Albania. And as other teams improve, the chances of Minnows getting results moves further away. But just as the San Marino national team of 2023 is technically a far superior team to the 1993 San Marino team that lost 7-1 to England, the England team of 2023 that beat San Marino 10-0 would comfortably beat the England side of 1993. Hell, that team had Stuart Ripley in it. There seems to be an increasing double standard in football. The English media decry foul of any talk of the Super League, but at the same time they don't want to compete against the perceived hammer throwers of Europe. And the irony is, England had the opportunity to play in a smaller group, but ended up playing both Andorra and San Marino because they failed to reap the benefits of the Nations League. Benefits Andorra at the very least have reaped, and showed a marked improvement in their play against teams that they can compete against. It seems counterintuitive to me to instigate the Nations League, to afford teams a proper chance of development, and then take away their right to compete in European and World Cup qualifiers. These teams may never qualify for a World Cup, but Sheffield United are not about to win the Premier League either. We're not going to start telling non-league teams that they're not allowed in the third round of the FA Cup, so why shouldn't Malta have the right to play England? And a final word on San Marino. Unlike many of the improving minnows of world football, the San Marino FA has been dedicated on developing their national team using native San Marinese players. At a time when so many smaller FAs are reaching for dual nationals, the commitment to players native to San Marino is commendable. San Marino may never play at a World Cup, but maybe someday soon they will finally beat another European team. I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who has made it this far. This is my first time making a video and editing one, and I'm pretty sure it shows. I apologise for any weird audio blips and bloops and editing errors. I wanted to re-record some bits, but full disclosure, I work in the Merchant Navy and my time at home has run out. I'll be heading out to sea tomorrow for 3 months, and I want to get this out before any more of my stats got even further out of date or San Marino actually won a game. I have got another couple of videos in the works, one about British ice hockey and my concerns for its future, and one about the video game The Long Dark, whose alpha is 10 years old this year. I'm not really looking to hit an algorithm, I'm making these videos for fun, and if people can take something from them, then all the better. As I said, I'm away for a little while now, so I'm going to work on some scripts and we'll hopefully have something out before May. But if you did enjoy this video, please like and subscribe and leave a comment down below about what you think of the Minnows of World Football. And again, many thanks for enduring my voice for this long.